Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger with our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute. It's February 17th, 2021. And Helga, we have an extremely dramatic development, which seems ironically to coincide with the release of our special report. And that is the cold front that's hit Texas, leaving between 3 and 4 million people freezing in the dark. This is really quite dramatic, isn't it?
Yes, it is actually very horrible because already 26 people died. Now, this is incredible. And, you have the state of Texas where the wind turbines froze up, the solar panels were covered with snow. So the energy production went down from an average of 25,000 megawatt to only 12,000 megawatt. And naturally, you have blackouts not only in Texas, but now there are rolling blackouts in 14 other states of the United States. Now, this is absolutely unnecessary. Uh, and I think it's not a natural catastrophe. People should not look at it this way, because if you had normal coal generated energy and nuclear energy, you would not have this situation. So people should not say this is a natural catastrophe, because I would rather say that we should take it, if you want to have a good note about it, we should take it as a warning from St. Peter, sending a warning sign what, could happen with the weather if you don't have the energy requirement to deal with it. So I think that, since we have this new report out called The Great Leap Backward, the New Green, the Great Reset, and the Green New Deal, I think there we have warnings in it, that, this will lead to blackouts. And, the blackout could even be more dramatic. We have the case of the EU, where studies were made by the Scientific Advisory Service to the German Parliament already 9 years ago, that you could have a collapse of the entire European energy grid, and that would have much more devastating consequences than even this. But this is bad enough. So I think, 4 million people in Texas, in the US, and 5 million people in the north of Mexico are without electricity. Now that means people can die in the cold. They can die of, basically the effects of it in various ways. And I think it's quite important that the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, and he was also the energy minister in the Trump administration, basically blasted this in a very powerful way, saying, that if you cut out coal, if you cut out nuclear energy, then you are completely dependent on an ideologically based energy policy, and people are dying. And that is what would happen if you have an energy policy defined by such people as AOC and and the like. So I think this is a very serious warning, and I can only advise people to get the special report EIR has put out, because the consequences of what the Great Reset would do. The Texas developments give you a meager foretaste of the kind of economic collapse which would result as a consequence of the implementation of this policy. And this could lead to very dramatic developments, social chaos. It would, have a devastating effect on the strategic situation, because some parts of the world are not so stupid. Japan, for example, when they had a snowstorm, I think it was last December, the energy minister immediately said that Japan must turn back on all of its nuclear plants. And, obviously, Russia, China, India, they are all massively investing in the production of fission energy, of the third generation fission energy, and naturally very much emphasis on fusion power. But I think, the idea that the world can live without coal plants, modern coal plants, which are absolutely environmentally friendly, I think this is really an illusion and must be corrected immediately.
One of the things I found most interesting is that Rick Perry, in his discussion, also mentioned the advances in nuclear fusion. So that's a very good sign that there are at least some people thinking. But Helga, we have another problem that this comes up against, which is the absolute dysfunction of the political parties in the United States, with the feud going on in the Republican Party, which broke out this week, with the Democrats, somewhat chaotic and stuck with nothing but the Green New Deal. How does this look to you?
Well, it looks very worrisome because, I mean, also the fact that Kamala Harris is now conducting foreign policy with President Biden resting in Camp David. I mean, this has caused the raising of quite some eyebrows because, normally a vice president participates maybe in overseas phone calls. But here, Kamala Harris is conducting foreign policy all by herself. So the question is, in what condition is President Biden? Naturally, the situation in the Republican Party is one of utmost chaos. And, I think that the only way how this can be addressed is that we have to organize with the LaRouche organization and the Schiller Institute to really promote absolutely the solutions of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and hopefully large segments of the population will understand that a change of the paradigm is absolutely necessary. At this point, there is the only voice of reason is really coming from the LaRouche organization and the policies promoted by my late husband. But it needs a broad mobilization of the population to change the course of these developments.
Well, one of the things that we are doing, the LaRouche organization is doing, is conducting a series of dialogues, such as the one from last Saturday on U.S.-Russia policy. It is clear that the war machine that was never removed under President Trump is now back on all gears, targeting Russia and China. Where do you see this headed?
Well, it is extremely dangerous. We had the Atlantic Council paper, the, the longer telegram, so-called, basically referring to the long telegram paper by George Kennan from 1946, now referring to the need to have regime change against China, especially targeting Xi Jinping for, to be toppled. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of such a government like China, and you hear that coming from the largest nuclear power and probably still the largest economy in the world, this has consequences. It leads to a hardening of positions. And, in a certain sense, this is going on against Russia with the Navalny campaign. So I think it's quite interesting that Professor Lyle Goldstein, who is from the Naval College, he made a couple of warnings, both in the radio and also in the Washington Times, by basically saying, that this is leading to a situation where there is practically a warlike situation between the United States and Russia, and that the people who are pushing the Navalny campaign should be aware of the fact that is it really in the interest of the West to have uh, a very sizable nuclear power like Russia to have chaos, or is it not in the interest of the Western countries that the nuclear weapons of Russia should be under the control of a stable, unified force I mean, just imagine you have a civil war in Russia, and then these nuclear weapons would get, into the hands of some strange terrorist kind of forces. So I think that there is actually the need to really be aware of that and come to the conclusion that this whole policy of sanctions against Russia is not functioning. This was, for example, just made as a statement by the head of the Kiel World Economic Institute, Mr. Felbermayr, who said, that the whole idea of sanctions against Russia does not function because you don't get countries like China or India or other partners of Russia to cooperate. So therefore, the only forces which are hurt by them is, in this case, emphatically Germany. So I think, that this whole policy of geopolitical confrontation can only lead to a complete catastrophe if it is pursued.
Well, there was also a very sharp warning coming from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, about the policies of the EU, which are definitely part of this anti-Russian grouping.
Yes, he said that if this is not stopped, if these sanctions are not stopped, that Russia is prepared to break off all relations to the EU. Now, there was a rather stupid article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, basically poo-pooing it, saying this is just meant to cause people to now say, oh, we should do something that this doesn't happen. But these liberals, and the FAZ is full of them, they don't understand the connection between cause and effect. But these policies, as I said, they lead to dramatic changes. I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of Russia and China, what is the natural consequence of these policies coming from the US, from the EU, from Great Britain? Already in October 2020, at the annual Valdai conference, Putin raised the possibility that this is not the first time it was raised, but he raised it publicly at this Valdai conference, the possibility of a Russian-Chinese military alliance. And this was brought up again in a meeting on the 4th of February this year, in a meeting between Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and Sergei Lavrov, discussing this option. Now, Putin, in some context, also said it's not necessary, but obviously it would be a major change in the strategic situation. What it would do is it would protect China if China would sort of come under the nuclear umbrella of the Russian nuclear forces, which are sizable, they're extremely modernized. Putin had introduced these new weapon systems, the hypersonic missiles, the nuclear-powered submarines, all weapon systems which sort of make the previous plans of a global missile defense system by the US obsolete, and by NATO. I mean, obviously, all these countries are working high speed on their own hypersonic missiles, so it's a dangerous arms race. But it would mean if China would come under the nuclear umbrella of Russia, it would completely change the situation for good. It would basically make a limited nuclear attack on China impossible, unless you want to have World War III all the way. It would basically allow China a greater flexibility in dealing with the problems in the South China Sea, in respect to Taiwan. It would definitely have an incredible signal effect on all the countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. It would basically give them assurance that there can be a peaceful win-win cooperation. Now, obviously, the efforts by the US is to counter that, and that was going on already with the Trump administration, Pompeo, Esther, to build the Quad. That is, the Indo-Pacific alliance, trying to pull India into an alliance with the United States against Russia and China. But that is the kind of geopolitical games which really is what led to World War I and World War II. And I think it is really something we have to overcome, because if this kind of geopolitical maneuvering is going on, the Damocles sword of nuclear extinction hangs over the world, and people should really wake up. I think that the only consequence for European nations is to stop this sanctions campaign against Russia, to stop supporting Navalny, who is it's a typical Western intelligence promoted operation for regime change in Russia. I think his support in Russia is very little. He has maybe hundreds of supporters, that looks big when they go on the street. But in reality, it's a very tiny fraction of the Russian population. And as we discussed previously, the Ashurkov, one of the campaign managers of Navalny, had begged the British second in command in the British embassy in Moscow for money so that they could do these operations. This is really something which should not happen. Regime change policy is a complete interference into the sovereignty of a country. And it is what Obama and Blair were doing, the so-called humanitarian interventions, spreading democracy. Democracy has gotten a very bad name as a result. And I think what should happen instead is that European nations like Germany, France, Italy, and others should leave NATO and rethink what is their security interest. I think we need to discuss a new security architecture, and that must represent the security interest of every single country on the planet if we want to overcome the danger of nuclear war. So I think the consequences of this is to really leave the kind of NATO alliance, which has become obsolete in any case after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. And right now, the idea to expand NATO as a global force is really, it will lead to World War III if it's not stopped.
You mentioned the China possibly going into an alliance with Russia. The Chinese made a threat that they may withhold rare earth materials that are necessary for aircraft construction and other kinds of defense contracting. How serious is that threat?
Well, I think it's being seriously looked at. I think the Chinese government has basically started an investigation exactly of what the effect would be, as you say, on the military sector, on the production of fighter jets. And I think if this escalation increases, one could actually see that happening. I mean, that would be a sort of a nuclear bomb, but it would seriously, it would be one of these signs of a pre-war situation if it happens.
Well, and speaking of pre-war, we're seeing a number of developments in Southwest Asia, around Yemen, also around Syria with Israeli strikes on Syria, threats to Iran. How does this situation look from your standpoint?
Well, I think the situation in Yemen is a complete tragedy, and also, I can only say the world community which allows this to happen. I mean, the Yemen population is the worst humanitarian catastrophe since years. It's escalating. Everybody knows it. Nobody does anything decisive about it. Right now, you have 2 million Yemen children under the age of 5 who are in acute malnutrition. 400,000 of those are in acute danger of starvation. Now, how easy would it be to, basically tell the Saudis, you open the ports, you allow the entrance of food aid, and if the EU and the United States and some other countries would really put their foot down, it could be remedied practically in a week. The fact that this is not happening, I really think that the EU policies on the question of refugees, what they have done with Frontex backing and participating in the pushback operations, all of these policies, are completely inhuman. And I think, any nation in Europe who wants to have a decent policy should leave the EU. the EU and NATO right now are really alliances which are completely against the interest of the member states. And there is no need to have a bureaucracy in Brussels. Look what they did in terms of getting vaccines. Von der Leyen is a complete failure. I mean, this woman was a problem when she was defense secretary minister in Germany. Now her record as a so-called president of the EU Commission is a disaster. Why does she not resign? She should resign. And I think the European nations should leave the EU and form an alliance as, republics of fatherlands, as de Gaulle was calling for it. And you can have a multinational cooperation for the development of Africa, for the reconstruction of Southwest Asia, and you don't need a supranational bureaucracy. So I think, these things have to be remedied. And these policies are clearly not in the interest of the European nations. And on the case of Yemen, I really appeal to all of our viewers, that is you, to help to change the policy in respect to this genocide which is going on in front of our eyes.
Now, speaking of the EU, we have the man from the yacht Britannia, who is now moving into power in Italy, Mario Draghi, former head of the European Central Bank. This is just another disaster. I mean, he's committing himself to the entire policy of so-called monetary integration. Is this going to go over in Italy?
Well, we have to see, I mean, right now you have the Lega being in the government, and they have one minister post. I think one big test case will be what happens to the bridge of Messina and also the Taranto steel plant, which Draghi basically wants to shut down and the EU wants to shut down. But this steel plant is the production facility which could actually produce the amount of steel needed for the Messina Bridge, which would, obviously completely change the dynamic in terms of the Mezzogiorno, bringing real development to southern Italy and Sicily. And, the Lega basically wants to convince Draghi to go ahead with this bridge. Let's see how this plays out. Draghi made a first speech in the Senate, which was unfortunately everything one could expect. He made this absurd statement saying that the more there is European integration, the more Italian the Italians become. He also called for Schumpeter-like creative destruction, saying that some industries are not worth to be saved. So this is exactly what one could expect from somebody who has been in the EZB for many years and demanding all kinds of reforms which created the problems in which Italy right now is. So this does not look good.
Well, to conclude, we want to go back to this whole question of Lyndon LaRouche's solutions. And you've been speaking very enthusiastically about the development of the space program in the United Arab Emirates. We now have a Chinese mission on Mars, and as of tomorrow, there will be the US rover entering Mars orbit. How significant is this? This really does represent, when you talk about the Texas situation being a foretaste of the bad things that could come from the Great Reset, doesn't this project around Mars give us a foretaste of the good things that could come out of international scientific cooperation?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, look, for the Mars missions, I mean, I'm still most impressed by this Emirates UAE operation, because this was a Mars mission which was only started, I think, 6 years ago. So in an incredible speed, they catched up, at least with Japanese help, but nevertheless. And they have now an orbiter on a Mars, Mars orbit. And, this shows you that any developing nation, I mean, after all, the Gulf states only discovered oil less than 30 years ago, and turned from total desert states into, in some cases, states which are really doing quite remarkable things in terms of, for example, the Emirates. They have this island which they, irrigated and turned into beautiful gardens and forests. And, when my husband and I were in Abu Dhabi in 2002, he made a speech there on the future of oil. This was organized by the Zayed Center. And he basically said, look, forget oil as a fossil fuel. It's too precious to be used for chemical production, for pharmaceutical production, and use the revenue to invest in the production of water that will green the deserts. And he advised basically to go for innovation and leapfrog. And this is exactly what the Emirates have done, and other Gulf states are going in a similar direction. They are cooperating with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. And now you have this Mars mission. Now, if you think what incredible technologies are opened up with space research and space travel. We have seen it, many years ago with the Apollo project, where it's often cited every cent investment brought back 14 cent in terms of value, as computers, as all kinds of side products. But we are now on the verge of, potentially getting fusion power as a propulsion, which is the only way how human beings could safely get to Mars. There is discussion about, studying the weather patterns, the underground water, the traces of life. And obviously, not only manned Mars missions are what is looked at, but a village on the moon, a city on Mars, creating the condition for, longer term existence of man on these planets as a stepping stone for future interstellar travel. Now, that means that the character of humanity will completely be transformed, because it's very clear that once you undertake such endeavors, you cannot have a geopolitical war on Mars, or else you will not live and you will not exist. And the kind of international cooperation among astronauts, which we have seen on the ISS, that is the model for the future cooperation among nations like the United States, Russia, China, India, Europe. The best policy about Europe, is their work on ESA, the European Space Agency, where the head of it, Mr. Werner, is enthusiastically speaking about the village on the moon all the time. And ESA has just put out a request for young people to be trained as astronauts. So, that program should be enlarged. Europe should have a much, much larger space program. And if a small country like the Emirates can have a Mars mission, why cannot Germany have a Mars mission on its own? Germany right now is on place 27 in terms of the number of people being vaccinated. The Emirates are, I think, on place 6 or 7. So there's something right which the Emirates do, and something fundamentally wrong what Germany does and the EU does. However, I think, this is the future. And if mankind is supposed to live as an immortal species, and that was a notion which was coined by my late husband, because we are different than other species, because we are, we have creative reason. We can solve any problem through scientific and technological breakthroughs by discovering new laws of the universe. And since our mind is the most advanced part of that universe, there is all the reason of optimism that once we attune our own existence and our own practice with the laws of the universe, our chances to become the immortal species is absolutely there. but it does require space travel as a precondition. And I think this idea of nations working together to discover the beautiful secrets of the universe, that gives you a taste of what the future of man can look like when we decide to become adults.
Well, Helga, it's always good to end with a healthy dose of optimism, as you just did. For our viewers, let me remind you, you can get the new report, A Great Leap Backwards, Why We Have to Defeat the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. You can go to the schillerinstitute.com and you can get an invoice for it. And Helga, I guess that's what we have now, so I'll see you next week.
And join the Schiller Institute.
Absolutely.